In a packed auditorium at a prestigious music industry panel, Taylor Swift was publicly mocked by a well-known liberal music journalist. But her quiet, devastating response turned the entire crowd on its head. It wasn't what she said, but how she said it that changed the atmosphere in the room completely. It was just after 6 p.m. in Nashville. The main hall at the Music City Convention Center was full. Almost every seat was taken by music students with notebooks, industry professionals in nice clothes, and fans who came just to see their favorite stars. The event poster promised an interesting talk about music's role in today's society. For people sat at the main table under bright lights. Among them was Taylor Swift, wearing a simple but elegant blue blazer, looking calm and confident. Next to her was Marcus Reed, a famous music writer known for his harsh reviews in major magazines and his strong liberal opinions. He wore a black sweater and had a small smirk on his face. The host, Dr. Sarah Wilson from Belmont University, stood up to welcome everyone. She tried to sound fair and not favor any of the guests. The talk was meant to last 90 minutes, with questions from the audience at the end. At first, everything went as planned. The speakers answered questions about making music, connecting with fans, and how songs can change society. Taylor talked about the importance of being honest in lyrics, while Marcus spoke about how music should challenge powerful people. The crowd listened carefully. Most people weren't even checking their phones, which was unusual these days. But about halfway through, the mood began to change. The mood began to change when a young music student asked how artists and critics could show more respect to each other, especially when they disagree. It seemed like a simple question, but Marcus saw his chance. He leaned toward his microphone and without even looking at Taylor, said with a tight smile, "Well, maybe not by writing breakup songs for 15 years straight and calling it growth." Some people in the crowd laughed. Others gasped. Many just looked down at their feet, suddenly uncomfortable. Taylor didn't react right away. She kept her eyes on the host, who had frozen for a second, probably hoping someone would change the subject. But Marcus didn't stop there. "I mean, when your biggest headlines are about who you're dating instead of musical innovation, that says something, doesn't it?" Now the laughter was louder, more certain. People were starting to pick sides. Taylor finally moved. She reached for her water, took a small sip, and leaned forward slightly. Her hands were folded together on the table. She hadn't said a word yet, but somehow everyone was looking at her now. The host cleared her throat. "Miss Swift, would you like to respond?" Taylor waited a moment, like she was deciding whether to answer or what to say. The pause felt longer than it was. But Marcus wasn't finished. He shifted in his chair, turning slightly toward the audience with a grin. "Look, I get it. Re-recording old albums is a smart business move. But let's not pretend that making the same music twice is artistic bravery. And if we're going to talk about music that matters, let's not confuse catchy pop songs with real cultural impact." His words hung in the air, sharp and clear. This time there were no gasps, just silence. The kind that fills a room right before something important happens. People looked at each other with raised eyebrows. Even the host seemed uncomfortable now. Taylor still hadn't responded. Marcus glanced at her, clearly waiting for her to get angry or upset, something he could use later in articles or social media. Taylor shifted slightly in her seat. Her face was calm, she didn't frown or look angry. She just looked up and met Marcus's eyes directly. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Was there a real question in all that?" The room stirred. A few scattered laughs emerged, not mocking but surprised. People didn't expect her to be so direct. But Marcus wasn't done pushing. "I'm just saying," he replied with that same smirk. "When people think of you, they remember the celebrity drama and the catchy hooks. Not the artistic substance. That's worth pointing out." Taylor turned to face the host. Her expression remained steady. "I've always welcomed fair criticism of my music," she said. "But personal attacks aren't conversation, they're just noise." Marcus raised his eyebrows. "Oh, come on, Taylor. If you're going to be in the spotlight, you should be able to take the heat. Or are we calling everything personal now?" There was debate. But Taylor didn't take it. "I've taken plenty of heat," she replied evenly. "Some fair, some not. That comes with the job. But I don't believe in tearing people down just to get a few laughs from a crowd." It didn't get applause, not yet. But something shifted in the room. The host tried to move on to another topic, but a young woman near the back stood up without waiting for a microphone. "Actually, I'd like to hear more from Miss Swift," she said. "How do you respond when you're criticized like that, not just tonight but in general?" Taylor nodded at the student. She stood up slowly from her seat and just like that, everyone was watching her. The room went quiet, not out of excitement but real curiosity. Everyone wanted to know what she would say next. Instead of fighting back with sharp words, Taylor did something no one expected. She walked to the center of the stage with a quiet confidence that didn't ask for attention but naturally earned it. No dramatic moves, no angry face, just calm steps like she had nothing to prove but everything to say. She adjusted the microphone and looked toward the back of the room, as if speaking to someone beyond just this audience. "I've spent years in recording studios," she began, "years working on songs that came from my heart. I've sat across from people who told me my music wasn't good enough, that I needed to change who I was to succeed." No one made a sound. Even Marcus looked unsure where this was going. "I didn't start making music because it was glamorous," Taylor continued in a steady voice. "And if you think writing songs about your real feelings for the whole world to judge is easy, you haven't been paying attention." She glanced briefly at Marcus, then looked away, not to ignore him but to show he wasn't the point. "I've been called names before worse than what you heard tonight. I've been mocked, criticized, and even threatened. I've had people camp outside my home just to take photos of me getting my mail. I've made music that people didn't like. That comes with being an artist." She paused, letting those words sink in. "But what I've never done," she said, her voice getting just slightly stronger, "is use a public stage to make another artist feel small just to make myself look smart or important." A hush fell over the room like everyone had just taken a deep breath at the same time. "I'm not asking you to like my music," Taylor said. "You don't have to enjoy my songs. You don't have to be a fan. That's your right. But don't confuse criticism with cruelty." The silence stretched longer now. Taylor changed her tone. "Some of you will leave school and enter a music industry where people will push you, judge you, and sometimes try to humiliate you. You'll be tempted to respond with meanness, with anger, with words that hurt. Words that might win you some laughs but lose you your self-respect." Her eyes moved across the crowd. "I'm telling you now, resist that urge." She let the silence continue before stepping back slightly from the microphone. "Because your voice doesn't have to be the loudest to be heard." A few claps started from the back, then more. Within seconds it spread across the whole room. Not like thunder but like a wave that couldn't be stopped. Marcus didn't move. His face was blank, not angry, not amused, just still. Taylor walked back to her seat without looking at the crowd, no smile, no victory look. She just sat down as if nothing unusual had happened. The host tried to get things back on track, but no one was really listening to him anymore. All eyes were still on Taylor. But it was what she said next that turned silent respect into something more powerful. The clapping had stopped, but the feeling stayed in the room. Not excitement, but something deeper, like everyone knew they had just seen something important. Taylor stayed in her seat, hands resting on the table. The panel was still going on, but everything had changed. Even the students who had been half looking at their phones earlier were now sitting up straight, not wanting to miss anything. Marcus looked at the host, clearly wanting to move on, but the host didn't. The audience didn't want more planned questions, they wanted something real. So Taylor gave it to them without being asked. She leaned toward her microphone again, speaking more softly now. "You know," she said, "when I was 19 I got a letter from a girl who was fighting cancer. She told me she listened to my songs during her treatments. She said the music didn't take away her pain, but it gave her something else to think about. Something that felt normal when nothing in her life was normal anymore." The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning. "I didn't send her money. I didn't cure her cancer. I just wrote her back and told her she mattered to me. That her story mattered." Taylor's voice didn't shake or break, but there was a warmth in it now, the kind that comes from sharing something real, not just talking about it. "I visited her at the hospital a few weeks later. I didn't bring cameras. This wasn't for publicity. I went because when she asked me why I kept writing songs when critics were so hard on me, I wanted to answer in person." A few students shifted in their seats. One girl in the front row wiped her eyes. "I told her I write songs because music helped me when I felt alone, and if my songs could do that for someone else, that was enough." She started crying, not because she was sick, she was used to that pain. She cried because someone had made her feel like her life was more than just her illness. Now the audience wasn't just listening, they were completely focused. "You can question my lyrics," Taylor said, eyes briefly moving toward Marcus. "But don't question my reasons. I didn't choose music because it was easy. I chose it because music once helped me feel less alone, and now I get to do that for others." Her voice was soft but strong. "That's not a headline. That's not a clever tweet. That's a purpose." For a moment even Marcus had no comeback. The host tried to get back on track, but before he could, a young man in a music school hoodie raised his hand. "Excuse me," he said a bit nervously. I came here tonight thinking I wouldn't connect with your music at all. And honestly, I'm still not sure I'm your target audience. But what you just said, that mattered. Taylor gave him a small nod. Thank you. That means more than you know. More hands started going up around the room. Not to challenge or argue but to ask questions. The mood had changed completely. People weren't there to pick sides anymore, they wanted to understand. Marcus sat quietly, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. He looked toward the exit then back at the panel. For the first time that night he seemed unsure of himself. And just when it seemed the moment had passed, Taylor shared one final thought that no one in the room would forget. She leaned forward slightly, her hands still calmly resting on the table. She looked around the entire room, not as a star trying to impress fans, but as someone who had found a truth worth sharing. If we keep turning music into a battlefield, she said, we'll lose the very thing that makes it special, its ability to connect us. She didn't raise her voice or add drama. She just stated it like a simple fact that had been obvious all along. The host stopped shuffling his note cards. Marcus stared down at his notebook but wasn't writing anything. In the audience, a man in his 40s leaned forward like he'd just heard something unexpected. Behind him, two students whispered to each other, "She's right though." Taylor continued, not to fill the silence but to make it meaningful. It's easy to be harsh. It's harder to listen. And honestly, most of us are tired, not of each other's music but of how we talk about it. People started clapping again, softly at first, then more strongly. It wasn't dramatic applause but something more genuine. Even some who had laughed at Marcus's jokes earlier now joined in. Marcus didn't clap but he didn't speak either. He just looked straight ahead. Taylor gave a small, sincere smile, then sat back down. The strange thing was no one rushed to speak after that. Not the host, not the other panelists. Everyone seemed to know that the moment needed space to breathe. Finally, the host cleared his throat and said, "Thank you, Miss Swift. That was powerful." The host looked at Marcus, clearly giving him a chance to respond. But Marcus just shook his head slightly, not in a rude way, but like someone who knew the room had changed and he was no longer controlling it. After a pause, the host tried to return to his planned questions. "Let's take a few more questions before we finish," he said. But the audience was still thinking about what they had just heard. A tall student near the back raised his hand and stood up without waiting for a microphone. "I didn't come here expecting to feel anything," he said honestly. "I thought this would be just another music industry talk with famous people saying nice things. But I don't know, that felt different." Many people in the crowd nodded in agreement. Taylor smiled gently. "I think we all want something better from these conversations. We just don't always know how to get there without tearing each other down first." That comment didn't make people cheer. Instead, it made them sit still and think because they knew it was true. Marcus finally spoke, his voice careful and measured. "Well," he said, "if nothing else, you've mastered the art of turning criticism around." Taylor looked at him without any anger in her eyes. The best response to noise is often clarity. And there was, the last word. No dramatic moment, no victory dance. Just a simple truth. But what happened next is what made the clip go viral. The panel ended a few minutes later but no one rushed to leave. Small groups of people stood talking in low voices. Some were discussing what had happened, while others seemed to be processing it quietly. Taylor didn't stay for autographs. She thanked the organizers, shook a few hands and walked calmly through the side exit with her team. No press talk, no selfies, just a quiet exit. But online things were just getting started. By the next morning, a shaky video of Taylor's response had been posted online. It wasn't professionally filmed, just someone's phone recording from a few rows back. The caption simply read, "Taylor Swift just showed us all how to handle criticism with class." At first it got a few hundred shares. Then thousands. Then the retweets started coming, not just from her fans but from people who had never supported her before. A rock music podcaster wrote, "I don't connect with her music at all, but this response was pure class." A music student from Nashville posted, "I was in that room. I went in thinking one thing and left thinking something completely different." Then came the big one. A retweet from a respected music journalist with millions of followers who had often criticized Taylor's music. He wrote, "Respect transcends musical taste." This was genuinely powerful. That's when the views exploded. News sites that usually ignored Taylor's activities suddenly shared the full video. Not to support her or her music, but because people were watching and talking about it. Meanwhile, Marcus Reed said nothing. He didn't post about the panel or share any quotes. When asked for comment by a morning TV show, his representative only said, "No comment at this time." It wasn't a scandal, No one had yelled, nothing had technically gone wrong. But people noticed something deeper. In what could have been just another music industry argument, Taylor had chosen grace, and people remembered that. The music convention released a short statement thanking all participants and promising more events that encouraged thoughtful dialogue. But by then, the moment had grown beyond their control. In coffee shops around Nashville, people were talking about what happened. Not because of who won the exchange, but because of how one artist had responded differently than expected. In an interview a week later, Taylor was asked why she responded the way she did. She shrugged slightly. "I wasn't there to win an argument. I was there to share what I believe. If I had responded with anger, it would have just proven the wrong point." The interviewer asked, "And what point did you want to make?" Taylor smiled. "That you don't have to be harsh to be honest." That quote appeared on social media posts, in captions shared by young musicians, and even on handwritten signs in music classrooms. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, but it felt real, which is why it spread. Conversations started happening at music schools. Students who had different tastes in music began talking about respect, not just preferences. They talked about criticism versus cruelty, about standing your ground without putting others down. And while Marcus's silence was never explained, it didn't need to be. His lack of response seemed to acknowledge that he'd been caught off guard, not by a clever comeback, but by something rarer, restraint. But the story doesn't end there. A few weeks after the panel, when the buzz was starting to calm down, something about the moment stayed with people. It wasn't about pop music anymore. It was about how quickly a room full of strangers had shifted from mockery to respect, not because someone had shouted, but because someone hadn't. At a music production class in Boston, a professor showed the clip during a discussion about industry culture. Students were asked to write their thoughts on what they saw. One student wrote, "It made me rethink how I talk about music I don't like. I'm not a fan of her songs, but I respected how she handled that attack." That was the thing. This wasn't about whether you enjoyed Taylor's music. It was about character, about the rare strength it takes to stay calm when someone tries to make you look small. At a songwriting workshop in Austin, a guest speaker mentioned the moment without even using names. "Sometimes the strongest voice in the room," he said, "is the one that doesn't need to tear others down to be heard." And back at the Nashville Convention Center, students who had attended the panel started something new, monthly meetups where musicians with different styles could share their work without fear of harsh judgment. They didn't call it a critique group. They called it the bridge, because that's what they wanted to build. None of that had been Taylor's plan. But she heard about it, and one afternoon, scrolling through her messages, she saw a note from a music student that simply said, "Thank you for showing us a different way to respond." There was no signature. Taylor saved that message not because it was about her, but because it reminded her that people are always watching, not just what you say but how you say it. We live in a time when angry responses spread faster than thoughtful ones, when mean comments get more attention than kind words. But every now and then someone changes the script, not by fighting louder but by refusing to fight dirty. That's what happened at that music panel. It wasn't about who had the cleverest comeback or who could be the most hurtful. It was about restraint, about the idea that you don't have to put someone down to stand up for yourself. Taylor Swift's response reminded people of that simple truth, and maybe it gave others the courage to try it too. Because at the end of the day, most people aren't looking for perfect arguments. They're looking for someone to show them it's still possible to be strong without being cruel. And if we're lucky, we'll see more moments like that, the kind that don't just go viral, but actually change how people treat each other. If this story moved you even a little, think about how you talk to people who like different things than you do. Remember that behind every opinion is a person with their own story. There are still voices worth hearing and better conversations to be had.